So we've talked about how to figure out your draw length. So I wanted to go over, I talked earlier about in one of the videos, kind of a general rule to figure out how long of a bow you need to make. It varies depending upon the type of wood you're using, but I suggest that you make your first bows long, fairly long, and at least somewhat fairly wide. It gives you a margin of error, and when you're learning, it's way more forgiving to make a longer bow. So the general rule is you take your draw length, you double it, add 20%, and that's about how long your bow should be with an unbacked wood bow. Like I said, that's just a general rule. There's ways to break rules and bend rules, but we're going to start with that. So let's say your draw length is 28 inches. So 28 times 2 is 56, and then times 20% is 11.2. So that gives you a total length of 67.2 inches. So we're going to just round it up to 68 inches. So we're going to make a 68-inch bow for a 28-inch draw. So I've got this piece of service berry here. I'm going to measure this out. And this piece is 72 inches. So there's plenty of length here. Now this, you got to look at your piece of wood, and this thing isn't perfectly straight. It's got this knot, kind of this weird deal right here with this knot right here. And so I want that in the middle where my handle is, so it's going to not affect my limb at all. So I've kind of measured, and it's 36 inches to that. So I've decided to go 34 inches to this knot, which will 34 and 34 will give me a 68-inch bow, and it'll put this right in the center of the bow. So I'm going to cut off. I've already marked, but I'm going to cut off this, a little bit off this end and a little bit off of this end. Now if you look at this, it's got a little bit of a swoop at this end anyway, so cutting that off will be good for me. If I roll this and you look at it, it's got some curve to it. So I want to have that curve on the back of my bow, so I have a little bit of reflex facing away from me. If I put the curve on the belly of the bow would naturally have some string follow in it, which wouldn't give you quite as good a bow. So I want that curve facing away from me. So I've rolled the bow around, I've rolled this log around, and to have that curve away from me, I want this to kind of be the top of my bow. So the next thing we got to do is, because this isn't a perfectly straight stave, and if you had an absolutely straight piece of wood, you could just use a straight edge to lay out your bow. But most pieces of wood aren't absolutely straight. Most trees don't grow perfectly straight. So you need to understand on wood bows that you can't think like modern bows are all laid out perfectly straight. You can't think that way when you're dealing with wood bows. You have to realize that you have to follow the grain in the wood and the way the tree grew. So that's where the string with the weights comes in. We're going to set this over the tip, over the end of the bow, and we're going to set this one over the end over here. And so that gives us a straight line, even although the bow curves in different directions. So earlier I talked about a bow has to line up in 3 points. It needs to be a straight line from the center of the tip of your limb to the center of your handle to the center of your tip, and then the limbs can go slightly outside of that. They can wave in and outside of that, and it'll still be a shootable bow. Because when it's strung, then your string should still line up in the center like it should. So what I want to do here is, now that I've got the string, I want to mark it in the center here. This is going to be the center line of my handle. And then I want to mark where this is out on these will be the centers of my tip. So I want to mark right underneath that string. There's going to be a mark there for the center of my tip. There's going to be a mark out on this end for the center of my tip. Okay, so that gives us our center line. Now I need to cut these ends off here real quick, so bear with me while I cut those ends off. This is where your handsaw comes in, or if you have a bandsaw. I have a bandsaw, but I'm going to do it with a handsaw just this tension. Okay, cut off this end. Now we got our bow cut to length. Next, what we want to do is lay out our handle. Double check. We got 34 and 34, so that's the center of our bow. So now there's different ways of laying out your handle. Unlike your English longbows, a lot of people lay out their handle like 1 inch on one side of center and like 3 inches on the other side. And what that does is it makes one limb taller than the other. And when you have one limb taller than the other, it's building in tillering into the bow. Because you're not holding a bow directly in the center, and you're not holding the string exactly in the center of a bow when you're drawing it, your top limb bends more than your bottom limb when the bow's tillered. And so by having the top limb taller, it's already making that limb weaker, and it allows it to bend more. So you're kind of building in tiller. But I don't like doing that. There's personal preferences, but the reason I don't like doing that is most of your Native American bows were made with both limbs exactly the same length, and I like that better on wood self bows, because if both limbs are exactly the same length, at any time during the building process I can flip the bow upside down. So if the string, when I finally get it bending and get a string on, if the string's off to one side or another, I can adjust for that by flipping the bow around, and it just makes things a lot more forgiving for you. If you have one limb that's naturally stiffer than the other, you can sometimes flip the bow around and just make your tillering easier and everything. So what I do is I lay out 2 inches on each side of the center line for my handle. Now that only gives you a 4-inch handle, which is fairly small. Some people like longer than that. But the shorter you make your handle section, the more limb bending limb you're going to have on your bows. And with wood bows, self bows especially, the more bending limb you have, the safer it is, the less chance of it breaking, the less chance of you having, if you have flaws when you're starting out, beginning, less chance of it having issues. The other thing is, if you're building shorter bows, sometimes you'll have a slight bend through the handle, and that way you're actually getting full bend of the piece of wood. If you're making a rigid handle, try to keep your riser section as short as possible. So I go 2 inches on either side of center for a 4-inch handle, and then I go 2 inches on either side of that, and that's going to be basically my fades. So when your handle, that's going to be where the end of my fades end up. So that's where fades are, where your handle transitions into your limb. And so basically from here to here is going to be non-bending. So that gives you basically 8 inches here that's not bending. If you make your handle even longer and your fades even longer, that's even more that's not bending. If you were to make a bow that bends through the handle, which we're not going to do right now because it's more advanced actually to do that, because you have to be real careful making it bend through the handle, or the bow can end up with a lot of hand shock, and or if it bends too much at the handle and takes a set so that the wood stays permanently bent, a little bit of bend here ends up being a whole lot out the tips, and you can end up with a bow that has a lot of string follow. So but in theory, if you made a bend through the handle bow, you could make your limbs almost 8 inches shorter, because you're making a bow with however long your riser is. That's not working at all. So that's one way to make shorter bows, is by making them bend through the handle. But for your first bow, go with a non-bending handle. So there's our layout for our grip and our fades. So then what I want to do is I want to mark this all the way around. Now you could take off your bark and then mark all this stuff, but the thing I don't like about that is then you've got to sand off your markings. You could do it with a pencil, but it's kind of hard to see if you do it with a pencil. So I like to leave the bark on until I get the bow roughed out, and then I take the bark off, scrape the bark off after I have my limbs already cut out to shape. So I like to mark this with a C for center, and then H is out here for, that's my handle, and F for fades. And that's mainly just so I can kind of keep track of what these lines are. So we're going to put this back in the vise. So now we've got our handle section. This is our center of our handle, where this line right here is the center. That's going to line up with these tips, the center and the tips. So now we have to draw a line down our bow, a center line down our bow. Now because the wood's not straight, you can't just draw a straight line on there. You can't just take a straight edge and lay it on here from that point to this point and draw a straight line, because these limbs curve a little bit. So what you want to do is you want to do this by hand, and you want to stay on the top of the crown of the bow. So where the crown is, the round part of the bow, I'll point this up at the camera here, but I want to stay up here at the top of the curve and follow the top of the curve to these lines. And it's not going to be a perfectly straight line. So I want to come out with this, and I want to stay on the top here, and see, I'm following the way the tree grew. This isn't going to be a perfectly straight line. Come along and go to where the center of my tips are going to be. Now you center your tips might be rolled off a little bit. They might not be perfectly on the top here because you might have had to go a little bit one way or the other to get those 3 points to line up. So when you're out a ways, you want to kind of slowly go over to whatever side that might be laying off of the top of the curve. So now, when I do this, my limbs should be following the grain of the bow. So see, this one got a little bit of curve here, so it's the same thing. I'm going to start, I'm going to go follow the top of the curve, follow the top. A lot of some books and stuff don't tell you to do this because they'll just have you do everything in straight lines, which is perfectly fine if this thing's perfectly straight. But like I say, you hardly ever find a piece of wood that's perfectly straight. So this is how to line them up. So there's the center line of your limbs. Now we just have to lay out the width of our limbs. What's that? So we have to lay out the width of our limbs. I want to talk a little bit about that. Now, obviously, this log's not very big around, so I can only get so much width on here. If this was a bigger log, I could get more width. The width kind of has to do with the type of wood. The denser woods can be narrower. Less dense woods usually need to be wider because a weaker wood needs more wood surface in order to withstand the compression, the stretching and the compressing of the bow as you're building it. So that's something you got to kind of experiment with depending upon the type of woods you're using in your area. But for beginners, I recommend try to make it fairly wide. 1 3/4 to 2 inches wide for your first bows. You can, once you start tillering the bow and making the bow, if it's too strong and things, you can narrow your limbs at that point, but you can't put wood back on. So lay out your first bows, fairly wide. Don't go too narrow. Okay, so now we're going to lay out the edges of our limbs, and we want to go as wide as we can. This isn't a very big log or stave, so I'm going to probably go around 1.5 inches, I think is what I'm going to do for my overall limb width. So this is where I use a compass. I like to use a compass because I can lay the one end right on my center line and then take my other end and mark my limb. So I just go along like that, marking this edge. So I go along, marking my edge. And I'm going to end that about 10 inches from the end of my bow because I have to, and I'm going to go back in and draw that line that I just marked. So that's one edge. Then I can just come in with my compass, flip it around on the other side, make sure that they're both the same size, which they are, and go back and mark this other limb edge. You can do it without a compass. You can just measure from the center line and make some marks and then connect them all together. But the compass works out real nice, and they're not that expensive. You can find them pretty cheap at garage sales or thrift stores or a hobby place where wherever. So now I've marked my lines out, and I ended 10 inches from the end here. How far out to keep your total width is something you have to play around with. It depends upon the type of wood you're using. The more dense the wood is, the more narrow your limbs can be. The weaker the wood is, or the less dense the wood is, then the wider your limbs should be, because it takes more wood surface on a weaker wood to withstand the stretch and the compression when the bow's being bent. So a larger surface area and more wood helps make the bow heavy enough, and helps it withstand those pressures when it's a weaker wood. So a stronger wood like Osage, this serviceberry is pretty strong wood. You can go a little bit narrower. So I recommend that you keep your limb width on your first bows at least out to like 3/4 limb, and then taper to your tips. You don't want to keep your tips too heavy, because that'll slow your bow down. The more weight you have out on your tips, the slower the bow is, because that weight's moving a lot when the bow limbs slide forward. So I'm going to go to like half inch at my tips. I can adjust those in later on, but I want to keep them somewhat wide so it gives me some wiggle room. This part you have to like just hand draw because it's a taper. So, and this line may not be perfectly straight. Your tip, because to get your 3 points to line up on your bow, your tips, the center of your handle and the other tips, when you had your string on here, you might have had to move your string off the center crown. So your center line might be off to one side or another, but you just need to follow on each side of that center line and taper to your tips. So that's that right there. And now we're going to move on to removing the wood on the sides here to get our profile. And I'll see you when I start that.